Lonely rancher. Let a strange woman and her child stay for one night, unaware they'd never leave his heart. Wyoming Territory, December 1878. Snow had blanketed the plains for days. The wind howled across the open land like a wolf with a broken heart, and the sky above Eli McCall's ranch was the color of old bones. Gray, heavy, unforgiving. His small wooden cabin sat lonely in the middle of 300 acres of frozen silence. No footprints had marred the snow for over a week. Nothing stirred, not even the cattle. Inside, Eli sat crouched near the fire, feeding in the last of his split pine logs. Sparks jumped like fireflies against the stone hearth. He rolled his stiff shoulders beneath a thick wool shirt, the cold having long become a second skin. Outside, the wind picked up. Then came the knock. It was not polite. It was desperate. 3 quick thuds, then another 2, sharper, like someone afraid the door might vanish if they waited too long. Eli froze, one hand on the iron poker. His eyes narrowed. Another knock. He reached slowly for the Winchester leaning against the wall. Bootsteps creaked across the floor as he approached the door. He placed his hand on the latch, then paused, cocking the rifle with a soft metallic click. Another gust of wind slammed against the cabin walls. Eli threw open the door. A woman stood there, wrapped in a soaked wool cloak, her hair tangled with snowflakes. Her face was pale, lips trembling. In her arms, a child no older than 6 lay limp, wrapped in a torn blanket, cheeks red from the cold, but unmoving. The woman's eyes met his, wild, pleading, exhausted. "Please," she said through chattering teeth, "just one night. My boy, he's so cold." Eli kept the rifle pointed low but steady. "I do not take in strangers," he said flatly. "Not in the middle of the damn night." The woman didn't flinch. She looked down at the child, then back at him. Her voice cracked. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't life or death." Eli studied her. Mud-caked boots, frost-bitten hands, the curve of her shoulder sheltering the boy. His eyes settled on the child's face. Blue lips, tiny hands clutching at nothing. A dying fire, if there was any spark left at all. He cursed under his breath and lowered the rifle. "Get inside," he muttered, stepping back. She didn't wait for another word. She hurried in, snow melting in her wake. Eli shut the door behind her with a hard thud. He threw another log into the fire and gestured toward it. "Sit close. Get him warm." She dropped to her knees beside the hearth, holding the boy near the flames. Her hands moved fast, rubbing his arms, whispering something too soft to hear. Her back trembled as she tried not to cry. Eli remained standing, rifle still in hand. "You got a name?" "Lydia," she whispered. "His name's Thomas." Eli nodded once. He walked over to the small cabinet and retrieved a worn quilt. Wordlessly, he knelt and wrapped it around both of them. The woman flinched at his closeness, but did not move away. He sat back on the edge of a chair, watching them, strangers who'd fallen out of the snow like ghosts from a past he had buried. For a long time, no one spoke. The fire cracked. Wind screamed beyond the walls. Inside, a war-hardened man watched over a woman with frost in her hair, and a child who had not stirred since she'd arrived. And though Eli McCall had spent years keeping his door closed to everything but the wind, tonight he had opened it. And somewhere deep inside that iron-wrought chest of his, something quietly began to thaw. The cabin had begun to warm, though the frost on the window panes held its grip like stubborn ghosts. Eli poured hot water into a dented tin cup, dropping in 2 leaves of dry mountain mint he had saved since fall. The scent was faint but comforting. He walked over and handed it to the woman crouched near the hearth. She looked up, startled, her eyes flickering with mistrust before softening. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low, hoarse. Illy nodded, then turned to stoke the fire. Thomas lay curled in the thick quilt now, his cheeks tinged with a hint of color, breath steady but shallow. The boy hadn't spoken a word. Eli watched him for a moment, then said without turning, "Where were you headed?" "South," Lydia said quietly, holding the cup between trembling fingers. "Anywhere warm." "You traveling alone?" There was a pause. She stared into the flames. "No, not really." Eli's eyes narrowed. He stood and leaned the Winchester against the wall, beside his chair. Slowly, he sat across from her, letting the heat ease into his bones. "You being chased?" Lydia flinched. The cup in her hand rattled. "I do not want trouble," she said, the edge in her voice barely masking the fear underneath. "We were just passing through." "But someone's looking. A man. We had to keep moving." Eli was silent for a moment, watching how she tucked the blanket tighter around the boy. "Your husband?" She looked up sharply, then away. "No," she said flatly, "not anymore." That was all she gave. Eli did not push. He simply nodded once and stood again. "I'll set up a cot by the fire for you. He can have the bed tonight." "You do not have to." "He needs warmth. That room holds it better." Lydia looked at him, her eyes glinting with a question she did not speak aloud. Eli didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and disappeared into the small back room. A moment later, he returned with a pillow and an extra wool blanket, placing them on the floor beside the fire. "Use what you need," he said, then walked back to the door. She watched as he slid a wooden bolt across it, then placed the rifle on the table within arm's reach. "Do you always sleep with a gun?" she asked softly. Eli glanced at her over his shoulder. "I stopped trusting silence a long time ago." She did not reply, just lowered her eyes. Minutes passed. The boy stirred slightly in his sleep. Lydia touched his forehead gently, then leaned back, her body folding inward as exhaustion overtook her. The tea cooled in her hands. She closed her eyes, lips moving in a prayer too quiet for Eli to hear. Eli took his chair beside the window. He lit a lantern low, casting only enough light to keep shadows honest. Outside, snow drifted past the glass in slow, relentless silence. Hours slipped by. The fire popped. Lydia and the boys slept huddled together, their breathing in rhythm. Eli sat unmoving, gaze flicking between the window and the forms sleeping near the hearth. He did not know their names a few hours ago. He still barely knew them now. But the ache in his chest was not from the cold. Somewhere around the third hour of silence he stood, walked slowly over, picked up a heavier quilt from the bench, and gently, carefully draped it over both mother and child. Lydia stirred slightly, but did not wake. Eli paused, looking down at her face, how the worry still etched itself into her even in sleep. He reached out as if to brush a loose strand of hair from her brow, then stopped himself. He turned away. Back at the window, he sat again. But this time, his hand found the rifle's stock and rested there. His eyes remained open. Though the snow fell quietly, though the fire was still crackling, Eli McCall did not sleep. And for the first time in many years, it was not fear or ghosts that kept him awake. It was a woman with no last name, and a child who did not speak, strangers wrapped in his blankets, sleeping beside his fire. The morning light came pale and slow, filtered through a sky thick with clouds. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered like a memory unwilling to fade. Eli had already been outside, tending to the livestock, his breath steaming in the frosty air, before he stepped back into the cabin, stomping the snow off his boots. Inside, the fire was burning low, but Lydia was already awake, her face drawn and tired. She sat on the floor near the hearth, a damp cloth pressed to the boy's forehead. Thomas was burning with fever. "I am sorry," she said softly, not turning to him. "We should leave before this becomes your burden." Eli set down his gloves, glancing at the boy. The child was flushed, sweating under layers of wool. "He is no burden," Eli replied. "You are not going anywhere until he's better." Lydia looked up at him, startled. "But I do not repeat myself." There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet certainty that left no room for protest. He moved toward the stove, pulling down a pot and filling it with water from the jug. "You got anything to treat fever?" he asked. She shook her head. "Then I will make what I can," he said. She watched him in silence as he sliced dried roots from a jar, added a handful of barley and some bits of salted meat. His movements were rough but careful, like someone used to being alone, but not uncaring. "I do not understand you," Lydia said at last, her voice low. Eli stirred the pot without looking up. "What's there to understand? You let a woman you do not know sleep by your fire, let her boy into your bed, and now you cook for us? You could have turned us away." "I thought about it," he said simply. Then I saw his face. Lydia's eyes lowered. She pulled the blanket tighter around Thomas. After a long pause, she spoke again. "Peace, not mine." Eli's hand paused at the pot. I did not give birth to him." He said nothing, waiting. "His mother was my friend," Lydia continued, her voice steadying. "She helped me leave my husband. She hid me, paid for a wagon, told me to run. She stayed behind, to buy time." Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched Thomas's hair. "He killed her, my husband. Said if I ever showed my face again, he would do worse to me. Thomas was left alone, so I took him." Eli turned slowly, leaning against the counter. His eyes were quiet, measuring. "And now he is mine," Lydia whispered, "even if I am not his." Neither spoke for a while. The stew bubbled softly. Outside, the wind scraped along the cabin walls like a warning. Eli finally crossed the room and knelt beside the boy. He took the cloth from Lydia, rinsed it in a basin of cool water, then placed it gently on the child's forehead. Lydia stared as he did so, surprised at how careful his calloused hands were. "Thank you," she said. Eli stood. "He will need food when he wakes." He turned and took a small, ragged square of fabric from the floor, Thomas's blanket, threadbare and fraying at the edges. He sat down near the window with a needle and some black thread and began to sew. Slow, clumsy stitches, but steady. Lydia watched in silence. Her lips parted, but no words came. This man, who barely spoke, who walked like a soldier and guarded his walls tighter than a prison, was mending a child's blanket with more care than anyone had shown her in years. And something cracked. Not loudly, just a hairline fracture somewhere deep inside. Eli finished the last stitch and folded the cloth neatly before setting it beside the fire. "I will keep watch tonight," he said without looking at her. "You get some rest." She stood slowly and moved to the bed where Thomas lay. As she sat beside him, she glanced back once. Eli had returned to the chair by the window, his rifle leaning on the frame, eyes already lost to the distance. But this time, there was something softer in the way he sat, something unsettled, and though neither of them said it, they both knew. This house, this night, this silence, it was no longer empty, not entirely. Eli McCall, a man long buried in routine and regret, had let something in, and it had nothing to do with the storm outside. The days began to pass with the slow rhythm of thawing ice. Though winter still gripped the land with its frozen fists, the cabin now breathed with something warmer than fire. Thomas's fever broke by the second morning. Weak, but smiling, he ate from a wooden spoon as Lydia fed him broth Eli had simmered through the night. The boy barely spoke, but he clung to Lydia's side and followed Eli with wide eyes. Lydia didn't leave. She said nothing about staying. Eli didn't ask. But each morning she rose before the sun, pulling her shawl tight, and followed him to the barn. She helped muck the stalls, her movements awkward but determined. She held the fence as he reshoed a restless mare. By the third day she was stacking firewood with rhythm and purpose, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back in a loose knot. "You're not half bad," Eli said, as she hauled the last log to the shed. Lydia smirked. "You say that like it's a surprise." He gave a low grunt, which, for Eli, was nearly a laugh. Later that afternoon they stood side by side chopping more wood. Snow glittered on the ground like crushed glass beneath a pale sun. Eli swung the axe with practiced force. Lydia gathered the split logs and carried them to the porch. After the last piece, Eli pulled something from his coat pocket and held it out. "Found these in the loft. Figured your hands might be tired of freezing." Lydia looked down. A pair of worn, well-oiled leather gloves. She hesitated. "I can't take those. They're just gloves." She took them slowly, her fingers brushing his. Then she looked up. Eli didn't speak, but his gaze lingered, steady, unguarded, unexpectedly soft. It was not a look of possession, nor pity, just presence. Lydia swallowed, then looked away, clutching the gloves to her chest. That evening, as snow fell in slow spirals from the dusk, Thomas ran across the cabin floor with a handmade wooden horse Eli had carved for him. He tripped over the corner rug and tumbled forward. "Papa?" The word slipped out. Quick. Natural. He froze. Lydia looked up, startled, her breath caught. Thomas turned to Eli, eyes wide with apology. I did not mean." Eli walked over slowly and crouched beside him. He placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said simply. Thomas blinked, then nodded, then grinned. Lydia turned away, her throat tightening. She stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold bite her skin. She gripped the wooden railing, staring into the endless stretch of white. She should be grateful. They were alive, safe, warm. But that boy, calling him Papa. And Eli, a man who had built walls high enough to keep out God himself, letting them stay, sharing meals, patching blankets, carving toys. Her heart ached. This wasn't hers to have. Behind her, through the window, she saw Eli lift Thomas onto his knee by the fire, the boy giggling quietly. Lydia pressed a hand to her chest. She knew. This was the kind of man women searched lifetimes for, the kind who said little but did everything. And for a woman like her, marked, hunted, broken, he was not something she could keep. Even if her heart, despite all its warnings, had already begun to whisper otherwise. The snow came softer now, falling like ash rather than ice. The days stretched in silence, marked by simple labors, gathering wood, feeding the livestock, boiling stew, but beneath every quiet moment was an undercurrent Lydia could no longer ignore. She had begun to withdraw. Not from fear of Eli, but fear of herself. Of how easily the walls she had built for survival were beginning to thin beneath his presence. How safe she felt in a place that was never meant to be hers. She stopped, lingering by the fire after supper. She avoided his eyes during chores. She told Thomas stories at night, long ones, so she could delay the silence that followed. But Eli was not a man to press. He let her pull away, without question. But his glances, soft, searching, told her he noticed. That night, after Thomas had finally drifted into sleep, Lydia stood in the doorway of the main room, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The fire cast a warm orange glow across Eli's face as he sat near the hearth, sharpening a blade in slow, methodical strokes. He looked up when she stepped inside. "You need something?" Lydia shook her head, then stepped closer. Her hands were trembling. I could not sleep." Eli set the blade down gently. "Storm's coming tomorrow," he said, voice low. "We'll be snowed in for a while." Lydia nodded, though she hardly heard the words. She sat across from him, hands clenched in her lap. The silence stretched. Then, softly, barely above a breath, she spoke. "I thought one night would be enough." Eli tilted his head slightly. "Enough. To rest. To survive the cold. To thank you and leave." He waited. She looked into the fire, as if afraid to look at him. "But now, I am afraid of tomorrow." Eli leaned forward slowly. His voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of a man who knew too well what fear cost. Lydia swallowed. "Because I know I cannot stay. I know I should not. And yet, when I think of leaving—" Her voice broke. "It feels like tearing something out of my chest." Eli stood, walked toward her. He knelt before her chair, his rough hand resting lightly over hers. "You do not owe me anything, Lydia." Her eyes welled. "It's the problem," she whispered. "I want to." The fire crackled behind them. Then, as if the silence had always been leading here, she leaned forward. Their lips met slowly. There was no rush, no hunger, just warmth, just stillness, just the quiet shattering of two people who had forgotten they could feel. Her fingers gripped the collar of his shirt. His hand slid to her jaw, holding her like she was something fragile, something he dared not wake. When they parted, breathless but close, Eli whispered, "If you have to go, at least know this." He brushed his thumb across her cheek. "Someone here wanted you to stay." Lydia closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she let herself believe that wanting could be enough, that someone could see her not as a burden, not as damaged, but as a woman worth staying for. But deep down, beneath the warmth, beneath the trembling joy of that kiss, she also knew. Love had never been her escape, and what bloomed in Eli's cabin might have already taken root too late. The morning came thick with fog, the sky a pale wash of gray. The air was still, too still. Even the birds held their breath. Eli stepped out of the barn and paused. Snow had crusted over in the night, but just beneath the surface were imprints, not hooves, boots, heavy, recent. He scanned the ridge. Nothing moved, but every muscle in his body tensed. Inside the cabin, Lydia was stoking the fire, humming softly to Thomas as he stirred beneath the blankets. When Eli entered, she saw his face and stood at once. "What is it?" He did not answer right away. He moved to the table and froze. There, sitting in the center, was a silver coin. Ordinary to most, but not to Lydia. Her blood ran cold. She reached for it, fingers trembling, and turned it over. A skull etched crudely into one side. Her breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. "He found us." Eli took the coin from her hand. "You know this mark? It is from a man my husband used to hire. A tracker. A bounty hunter with no laws, only gold." She looked up, voice cracking. "He's close. He would never leave a token unless he was watching." Eli moved to the rifle by the window. But before his hand could close around it, a knock rang out. Not frantic this time. Calm. Measured. Lydia flinched. Ellie opened the door, gun raised. A man stood there in a long coat, dusted with frost, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A scar split his cheek from lip to ear. His gloved hands were empty. "Morning," he said coolly. "Name's Jasper Cole. I'm here for the woman." Lydia stepped beside Eli. "She's not going anywhere," Eli said. Jasper smiled. "See, I got paper says otherwise." He pulled out a folded parchment, an arrest order, signed and sealed. Eli didn't move. "She's wanted for theft and kidnapping. Her husband, legal husband, filed charges in Cheyenne. I am to bring her back, alive, preferably." "She stole nothing," Eli growled. "And the boy's mother is dead." Jasper's smile never reached his eyes. "Not my concern. I was paid to bring her in, and paid more if I make it look like she resisted." Lydia stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "Stop. I'll go." "No," Eli said. But Liddy turned to him. "If I fight, Thomas gets dragged into this. You'll get killed. Please." She faced Jasper. "Let me say goodbye." Jasper nodded, amused. Eli followed her inside. She knelt beside the boy, who was half awake. She kissed his forehead, whispering something Eli could not hear. Then she stood, brushing past Eli. He grabbed her arm gently. "Lydia, I have to," she said, voice breaking. "It is the only way to end this." She stepped outside. Jasper took her by the elbow, not unkindly but firmly. Without a word, they walked into the fog. Eli stood at the doorway, fists clenched. Then, slowly, without a sound, he turned back into the cabin. He crossed to the corner, lifted a loose floorboard, and drew out a wooden chest. Inside, a faded blue coat, frayed at the cuffs, a box of bullets, a revolver, and a folded letter with a name he had not spoken aloud in years. He laid it all out on the table, his hands moved with practiced certainty. Then he sat, took a scrap of paper, and began to write. "Thomas, if I do not return, be kind, be strong, be brave, like your mother. You are not mine, but I would have given anything to be. Never forget that someone once loved you enough to fight for your tomorrow." He folded the note, placed it beside the rifle. Then he pulled on the old coat, fastened the buttons, loaded the chamber. The fog outside had thickened, but Eli McCall stepped into it without hesitation, the wind at his back, the weight of love in his hands. He had not gone to war for his country, but now, for her, he would go to war for his heart. The snow fell heavier now, thick and fast, as Eli thundered across the open field. His horse's breath steamed in the air, hooves pounding the frozen ground. The world narrowed to a trail of fresh wagon tracks, and the dark blur ahead moving through the trees. Branches slapped at his coat, ice clung to his beard, but Eli did not slow. The wagon was just ahead, pulled by a single horse, trudging through a narrow pass lined with pines. On the seat sat Jasper, reins loose in one hand, a rifle across his lap. Lydia was bound behind him, huddled under a blanket, her face pale and unreadable. Eli drew his gun and fired a shot into the air. The wagon jerked to a halt. Jasper turned slowly, saw him, and grinned. "Well now," he drawled, "I was hoping you'd come." He climbed down from the wagon, eyes never leaving Eli. He left Lydia where she was and stepped out into the snow, gun drawn, coat flaring like wings. Eli dismounted, landing hard. "You could have walked away," Jasper said. "Could have let the law take her." Eli raised his gun. "That man is not the law, and you sure as hell ain't justice." They stood 10 paces apart, eyes locked, hands steady. Then Jasper fired first. Eli dove sideways, rolled behind a tree. A bullet slammed into the bark, inches from his head. He returned fire, one shot, clean, grazing Jasper's side. The man grunted and stumbled, blood soaking through his coat. But Jasper did not fall. Instead, he turned and fired at the wagon. The shot cracked wood, then silence. Lydia screamed. Eli broke cover, rage driving him forward. He fired again, hitting Jasper in the leg. The man dropped to one knee, snarling. "You want her?" Jasper shouted. "Go get her!" And he aimed one last time, straight at the horse. The animal reared in panic, the wagon tipping. Eli ran. He reached the wagon just as it buckled to one side, Lydia tumbling out, rope still around her wrists. He covered her with his body. A final shot rang out. Pain tore through his shoulder like fire. He collapsed beside her. Blood soaked into the snow. Lydia screamed his name, fumbling to free herself, cradling his head in her lap, her hands, slick with red, pressed against the wound. "Eli, Eli, stay with me." He blinked slowly. Her face swam above him, haloed in snow. "Am I dying?" he whispered, coughing. "No, no, you are not." His breath hitched, then he smiled, just faintly. "You're the only thing I never, never regret." Tears spilled down her cheeks. Behind them, the wagon creaked, half broken. Jasper lay motionless in the snow, his rifle out of reach. A cry broke through the trees. "Shane! Thomas!" The boy ran across the snow, stumbling through drifts, his small arms pumping. He dropped beside Eli, eyes wide with horror. "Papa, please don't sleep." Eli tried to lift a hand, managed only a twitch. "I'm right here, son," he whispered. Then darkness tugged at him. But the last thing he felt was Lydia's touch. Her forehead pressed to his, her breath warming his frozen skin. "I'm not losing you," she said, "not now." The winter melted slowly that year, as if reluctant to let go. Snow gave way to wet soil, and the streams began to whisper again beneath the thaw. The land softened, but Eli McCall's body did not. He lay in bed for weeks, fevered and half-conscious, the wound in his shoulder refusing to close clean. Sometimes he drifted in and out, hearing voices that weren't there. But through it all, Lydia stayed. She fed him broth when he could not lift a spoon, wiped sweat from his brow, changed the dressing on his wound with gentle fingers. She did not complain. She did not cry. She just stayed. And when the pain made him grit his teeth until his jaw ached, she would sing to Thomas in the next room, soft lullabies he half remembered from some dream. Spring came, slow but certain. When Eli finally stood on his own 2 feet again, the frost had left the porch railings, and the first yellow buds were pushing through the earth. The fence line, shattered during the last storm, leaned like a drunk. Eli, still stiff but stubborn, began to rebuild it post by post. Lydia worked the soil behind the house, planting rows of tomatoes and onions. Her hands were cracked from sun and dirt. She no longer looked like someone passing through. She looked like someone who'd built a life here and meant to keep it. Thomas followed Eli like a shadow. He learned to saddle a horse, to check traps, to hold a rifle with care. "Not to hurt," Eli told him one evening, adjusting the boy's grip. "To protect what matters." Thomas nodded solemnly. A year passed. The cabin, once echoing with emptiness, now breathed with life. The hearth stayed warm, the garden bloomed. There was laughter now, not loud, but real. The ghosts that haunted the corners had quieted. Even the silence had softened. One afternoon, Lydia stood at the edge of the field, watching Eli mend a broken rail. His movements were slow, precise. The sun caught the silver in his hair. When he looked up and met her gaze, his eyes were steady. "Sure." She smiled. He tipped his hat. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Eli sat at the table with a pen and paper, the oil lamp casting shadows on the walls. His hand trembled, not from pain, but from something deeper, something full. He wrote slowly, "I once thought snow was the coldest thing I'd ever known. But it was not. It was the silence of my own heart, the kind that comes from locking every door and pretending you do not need to be found. Then one night, someone knocked, and I opened the door, and I never wanted to close it again." He folded the paper, slipped it into the drawer beside the old rifle. Outside, the wind rustled the grass. Inside, everything was still and warm. And so, from a single knock on a snowy night, a man who thought he had nothing left found everything he never dared hope for. In the silence of the frontier, love did not come with fireworks or promises. It came with a warm quilt, a carved toy, a pair of weathered hands holding on when the world tried to pull them apart. Eli McCall opened his door to a stranger, and in doing so, opened his heart to something he thought he'd lost forever. A reason to stay, a reason to fight, a reason to live. Because sometimes the fiercest love is the quiet kind, the kind born in storms, raised in stillness, and carried through seasons. If this story stirred your heart, made you hold your breath, or brought a tear to your eye, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every week we bring you timeless tales of forbidden romance, haunting sacrifice, and love that defied the lawless land. Hit the bell, stay with us, because out here on the frontier, where bullets missed, hearts didn't.